Dakota Territory, 1885. Jonah Crane had learned young exactly what charity cost a man because he'd watched his father accept it once, and the accepting had cost them everything they owned. He had grown up on 300 acres of good grazing land his father had built from nothing, and he had watched, at 17, a smiling banker named Ezekiel Voss extend his father a generous loan in a hard year. The kind of loan that came with a smile and a handshake, and terms that seemed almost too kind to question. His father had taken it gratefully. 18 months later, a clause neither of them had understood came due all at once, and the Crane Ranch belonged to Ezekiel Voss, who folded it quietly into what would become, over the following decade, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Jonah's father had died 2 years after that, not of any single illness, but of the particular exhaustion of a man who has watched his life's work become another man's asset. Jonah had been 19. He had spent the 11 years since working other men's herds, taking wages and nothing else, refusing every offer that smelled even faintly of a favor, because he had learned, at 17, exactly what a favor could turn into if you weren't careful about the fine print. He rode into the town of Sweetgrass Flats on a windy April morning with a bedroll, a good horse, and a reputation, earned honestly over a decade, as the best cattleman for hire in the territory who would absolutely not work for Ezekiel Voss. He found the herd before he found the woman. 40 head of cattle grazing loose across an unfenced quarter section, a young hand struggling visibly to manage them alone, and a herd bull that had clearly decided this particular morning was the morning to test every fence post on the property. Jonah reined in, watched the chaos for exactly as long as it took him to understand the shape of the problem, and rode in without being asked to help turn the herd back toward the home pasture. By the time it was done, a woman was waiting at the gate. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Wasn't difficult," Jonah said. "Your hand's green. No fault of his, but he needs another man out here who isn't." She studied him. 28, maybe 29. Dark hair pulled back under a wide hat. Direct brown eyes that had clearly spent a great deal of time this year doing arithmetic that didn't come out right. "You looking for work, Mr. Crane?" Jonah Crane.
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Something crossed her face at the name, recognition, though not unkind. "The crane operation that Voss took in '74. That's the one. If stories like this find their way to you, hit subscribe before we go further, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight." "I'm Josephine Bellamy," she said. "This was my aunt's operation. She left it to me in February. I need a foreman who knows cattle and isn't afraid of Ezekiel Voss, and from what I hear, you're both." "I don't take charity," Jonah said, an old reflex, worn smooth from 11 years of use. "Good," Josephine said. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering the other half of this herd." She explained the terms plainly, standing at the gate with the wind pulling at her hat brim. Her aunt, Margaret Ellis, had run 400 head on 800 acres for 20 years without a husband or much help, a fact the town of Sweetgrass Flats had never quite stopped remarking on. Margaret had died in February, leaving Josephine, her only living relative, a school teacher from Bismarck who had never run cattle in her life, the entire operation, the debts attached to it, and a labor problem that would only get worse before the spring roundup. "I need someone who can run this herd like it's his own," Josephine said, "because in every practical sense, it needs to be. I can't pay a foreman's wage and keep this ranch solvent. What I can do is offer half the herd outright in exchange for you running the operation as though half of it already belonged to you. Because it will." "You don't know me," Jonah said. "I know you rode in unasked and fixed a problem you didn't create," Josephine said. "I know you've spent 11 years turning down every offer that smelled like a favor. which tells me you understand exactly the difference between charity and a fair trade. This is the second kind. Jonah looked at the herd, then at her, then at the 800 acres of good grass rolling out toward a horizon that included, somewhere past the tree line, the northern edge of what used to be his father's land. "All right," he said. She almost smiled, the first real crack in the composed exterior she'd worn since he rode up. "You're going to want to see the books before you commit to that this thoroughly," she said. "My aunt kept excellent records, but excellent records on a struggling operation are still a record of struggle." "I've read worse," Jonah said. "Have you?" "I read the paperwork on my father's loan 11 years after it would have done any good to read it," he said. "Nothing since has looked half as bad." She studied him a moment longer, something settling behind her eyes. "Then you already know the most important thing about running a place like this." "What's that?" "That the numbers only tell you what already happened. They don't tell you what a person's willing to do about it." She extended a hand. "Welcome to the operation, Mr. Crane." He shook it. "Jonah's fine." "Then it's Josephine," she said. "At least when we're not in front of the bank." The arrangement was drawn up formally within the week, witnessed by the circuit lawyer in Sweetgrass Flats, and filed properly at the land office because Josephine Bellamy, schoolteacher though she'd been, had inherited her aunt's exacting relationship with paperwork along with everything else. Half of 400 head transferred outright to Jonah Crane, contingent on nothing except his labor and his word, both of which he gave without hesitation once he understood the offer wasn't a trick. He moved into the foreman's cabin on the property the following day and began the work of understanding an operation that had, in Margaret Ellis's final year, begun to show the particular fraying that comes when one person tries to hold too much alone for too long. Fence lines needed mending. The spring roundup was 6 weeks out and badly underplanned. And the northern boundary, Jonah discovered within his first week of riding the property, ran directly against 1,100 acres belonging to Ezekiel Voss. "He's made 3 offers on this place since my aunt died," Josephine told him, the first evening they reviewed the ranch's books together at her kitchen table. "Each one lower than the last, like he expects me to get more desperate rather than less." "He does that," Jonah said. "Did it to my father. Kind offer first to make you grateful. Then he waits." "Waits for what?" "For something to go wrong that he can point to as the reason you should have taken the kind offer." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "Something's already gone wrong, hasn't it? That's why you know the pattern so well." "Something's already gone wrong for a lot of people who used to own land next to Ezekiel Voss," Jonah said. "I intend for you not to be one of them." The work of the following weeks fell into a rhythm neither of them commented on directly. Jonah rose before dawn to ride fence and assess the herd, and Josephine, despite having taught arithmetic and penmanship in Bismarck for 6 years rather than branding cattle, proved to have her aunt's stubborn refusal to be told a piece of land's business was beyond her. She rode out with him most mornings, asked questions with the particular thoroughness of a former teacher determined to actually understand a subject, rather than simply survive it, and by the end of the second week could rope a calf competently enough that the green hand, a 17-year-old named Wyatt, had stopped being embarrassed about needing instruction from a woman. "You didn't grow up doing this," Jonah said one morning, watching her coil a rope with careful, deliberate hands. "No," Josephine said. "I grew up grading spelling tests and wondering if there was more to my life than a schoolroom in Bismarck. Then my aunt died and left me 400 cattle and 800 acres, and I discovered there absolutely was more to my life, whether I was ready for it or not." She finished the coil. "Margaret used to write me letters about this place. I always thought she made the work sound more romantic than it probably was. Was she wrong? Josephine considered this, looking out over the herd grazing in the gold morning light. No, she admitted. She wasn't wrong. It's harder than she made it sound. But she wasn't wrong. Their trips into Sweetgrass Flats for supplies became a weekly rhythm through May, the two of them riding the wagon in together, Wyatt trailing behind on the horseback more often than not to learn the route and the town's particular commerce. The general store's owner, a wary but fair woman named Constance Pryor, had known Margaret Ellis for 2 decades and made a point, the first several visits, of studying Jonah with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether a stranger deserved a widow's, or in this case, an orphaned niece's, trust. "You're the Crane boy," Constance said the third week, handing over a crate of supplies. "Voss took your father's place." "That's right," Jonah said. "Good," Constance said, with the particular bluntness of a woman who'd run a general store long enough to stop softening her opinions. About time somebody who actually hates that man properly ran cattle next to him instead of just resenting him from a distance. She looked at Josephine. "You picked well, dear, whether you knew it or not." "I'm beginning to gather that," Josephine said, and Jonah, loading the wagon, allowed himself something close to a genuine smile. The town's opinion of Josephine herself shifted more slowly. In the particular way, small towns reconsider an unmarried woman running cattle without a husband's name on the deed. By early June, though, the consistent sight of her handling her own business at the land office, the bank, and the sheriff's office with unbroken competence had done more to settle the town's opinion than any amount of explanation could have. Trouble arrived the way it generally arrives on a contested boundary, quietly at first, and then all at once. 10 head went missing from the northern pasture in the second week of May, driven off in the night through a cut section of fence that backed directly onto Voss land. Jonah found the cut wire at dawn and stood looking at it with the particular stillness of a man recognizing a familiar shape of trouble. "Rustling," Josephine said when he brought her to see it. "You think it's Voss's men?" "I think Ezekiel Voss has never personally cut a fence wire in his life," Jonah said. "I also think he's never once had to because he's always got men willing to do it for him, and a lawyer ready to argue the cattle wandered onto his land of their own accord if anybody asks hard questions." "Can we prove it?" "Not yet," Jonah said. "But cattle with a brand don't disappear as cleanly as Voss thinks they do." They rode into Sweetgrass Flats that afternoon and filed a formal report with Sheriff Amos Doyle, a tired, methodical man who had dealt with enough boundary disputes near Voss's operation to take the complaint seriously without being told twice. Doyle rode out to the Voss ranch himself 2 days later, found nothing conclusive, but left Voss with a plain warning that the sheriff's office would be watching the northern boundary closely through the spring. It didn't stop everything. But it was, Jonah told Josephine that evening, exactly the kind of friction Voss generally preferred to avoid. I want to pause here for a moment because Josephine's situation says something true about the particular difficulty of inheriting a life you didn't choose. She hadn't asked to run 400 head of cattle. She'd asked, if anything, for a quiet schoolroom in Bismarck and a predictable life. What she got instead was harder and stranger, and by every account she gave later, better, because it turned out the thing she actually wanted, without knowing it, was something worth building rather than something merely comfortable. This is the 4th story we've told here, and if you're new to this porch, welcome. There's more waiting for you if tonight's story finds a place in your evening. Now let's get back to Sweetgrass Flats. Because Ezekiel Voss doesn't strike me as a man who takes a sheriff's warning as a final answer. The dry well came next, in the first week of June, when the Bellamy operation's secondary water source, a shallow well that fed the northern trough during the driest weeks of summer, simply stopped producing. Jonah rode the length of the feeder creek that supplied it and found, a half-mile upstream, a newly dug diversion channel, redirecting the water onto Voss land before it ever reached the Bellamy well. "That's not rustling," Josephine said, standing at the dry trough with her jaw set. "That's slower and worse. It's also harder to prove in front of a judge," Jonah said. "Water rights on an unregistered feeder creek are a mess even when nobody's cheating. Voss knows that better than anyone in the territory." "Then what do we do?" "We dig our own channel back," Jonah said, "and we document every foot of it, and we ride to the Territorial Land Office in Bismarck and file a formal water claim before Voss can file one first." They rode to Bismarck within the week, 3 days each way, hard riding, Josephine handling the Territorial Land Office clerks with the same exacting precision she'd once applied to grading essays. Filing a properly documented water claim that named the creek, mapped its historic course, and included 2 affidavits from longtime neighbors who remembered the Bellamy well drawing from that source for 20 years before Voss ever built anything near it. The land office clerk, a precise, unhurried man named Gideon Wells, who had processed enough contested water claims in the territory to recognize a well-prepared one immediately, reviewed their documentation twice before nodding. "This is unusually thorough for a filing this size," he said. "I used to grade student work for a living, Mr. Wells," Josephine said. "I don't submit anything I haven't checked twice myself." Wells almost smiled. Voss's filings usually come in half this complete and twice this arrogant. Refreshing change. He stamped the documentation. "This will hold up, Mrs. Miss Bellamy. I'd stake my professional judgment on it." Jonah, standing slightly behind her through the whole exchange, found himself thinking that he had spent 11 years assuming competence, like this belonged only to men with banks behind them, and that watching Josephine work a room of territorial clerks with nothing behind her but her own preparation was, in its own quiet way, more impressive than anything he'd learned about cattle in a decade of ranch work. Voss's counterfiling arrived 4 days after theirs. It was, by then, 4 days too late. Ezekiel Voss came to the Bellamy Ranch himself in late June, the first time he had bothered to appear in person rather than send an offer through an intermediary. He was older than Jonah remembered from childhood, silver-haired now, still smooth-spoken, still wearing the particular calm of a man who had rarely lost anything he'd truly wanted. "Miss Bellamy," he said, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy, then turning his attention deliberately to Jonah. "And young Crane. Been a long time." "Not long enough," Jonah said. Voss's smile didn't waver. "I understand there's been some unpleasantness. Missing cattle. A water dispute. Territory's a hard place for an operation without deep pockets behind it." He looked at Josephine. "I'd still take this place off your hands at a fair price, if the difficulties are proving too much." "The difficulties are proving entirely manageable," Josephine said. "Sheriff Doyle's watching your northern hands closely these days, and the Territorial Land Office confirmed our water claim on Thursday, with your own counterfiling entered 4 days behind ours." She held his gaze steadily. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss, Mr. Voss." Voss looked at her for a long moment, then at Jonah, something calculating shifting behind his eyes. "Your father made a similar mistake, Jonah. Thought pride would keep a ranch solvent." "My father's mistake was trusting a kind smile over a written contract," Jonah said. I signed a written contract, Mr. Voss. Every clause of it read twice, by a lawyer Miss Bellamy hired specifically because she'd heard what happened to my father. There's nothing here for you to wait out. Voss's expression flickered, just once, before he recovered it. He tipped his hat and rode off without further pleasantries, and Jonah stood watching him go with the particular satisfaction of a debt 11 years overdue finally, if only partially, repaid. Summer settled into the ranch with the specific rhythm of two people who had stopped protecting themselves from each other somewhere around the water rights filing in Bismarck. Evenings on the porch became a habit neither of them named. Josephine grading the ranch's books instead of spelling tests now, Jonah mending harness beside her. The comfortable quiet of two people who had already shown each other the worst of what a hard year could ask of them. I looked you up in the county records while we were in Bismarck, Josephine said one evening, not looking up from the ledger. Your father's original claim, 300 acres, filed in '68. Jonah went still. Why? Because I wanted to understand exactly what charity cost you, she said. 11 years of refusing anything that looked like a kindness. Because the one kindness your family ever accepted turned into the worst thing that happened to you. She closed the ledger and looked at him directly. I need you to understand that what I offered you at that gate in April wasn't kindness. It was recognition. I saw a man who'd ride in and fix a stranger's problem without being asked. And I thought, that's exactly the kind of partner a ranch like this needs. Not charity. Judgment? I know that now, Jonah said quietly. Did you know it in April? He considered the question honestly. No, he admitted. In April, I thought I was taking a job. It took me most of May to understand you'd actually offered me a life. They were married in September at the Bellamy Ranch house itself, with Sheriff Doyle standing as witness and half of Sweetgrass Flats in attendance, because the town had, over the course of one contested summer, developed a genuine fondness for the schoolteacher who'd outmaneuvered Ezekiel Voss at his own game. Margaret Ellis's old ranch house, which had stood quiet and half-empty since February, filled that September afternoon with more noise and warmth than it had likely seen in a decade. Jonah built a proper addition to the foreman's cabin that autumn, not because tradition demanded it, but because 400 head of cattle, soon to become a great deal more once the herd's calves came due in spring, required a working ranch office closer to the northern pasture than the main house allowed. He built it with his father's old tools, restored and rehandled. The first time in 11 years he'd used them for something that was unambiguously his own. The northern boundary held through that autumn and the following spring, the water claim, standing firm at the territorial land office, Ezekiel Voss's operation quietly, gradually. No longer the only serious cattle concern in the county. Wyatt, the green hand who'd once struggled alone with 40 loose cattle, became by the second year a genuinely capable cowhand. In no small part because Jonah had made a point of teaching him the way he wished someone had been able to teach his own father. Patiently, honestly, and without ever once making the help feel like a debt. On an October evening the following year, with the second calving season successfully behind them, and the herd grown past 600 head, Josephine found Jonah sitting on the porch looking out at land that stretched, by every legal measure now, entirely and permanently theirs. Regretting the herd, she asked, sitting beside him. Best trade I ever made, he said, though I still think about what I'd have said if you'd called it charity that first morning. What would you have said? I'd have ridden off, he admitted, proud and wrong, same as I'd been for 11 years. He looked at her. Glad you knew better than to let me. I didn't know better, Josephine said. I just refused to accept that a man who'd ride in unasked to fix a stranger's cattle problem was actually as stubborn as he was pretending to be underneath it. I was that stubborn. You were, she agreed. You just weren't only that. Margaret used to say the whole territory was full of men who'd rather be right and alone than wrong and helped. I didn't want that for you. Turned out I didn't want it for myself either, if I'm honest. I could have hired any competent foreman that spring and kept this place at arm's length the way my aunt always warned me the business required. I chose the harder thing instead. Jonah looked out at the herd, dark shapes moving slowly across gold evening grass, 600 head where there had been 400, on land that had, through one contested summer, become unambiguously theirs rather than merely hers. I used to think the safest thing a man could do was owe nobody anything, he said. Spent 11 years proving it to myself, one refused favor at a time. He took her hand. Turns out, the safest thing was finding somebody worth being obligated to. She laughed, low and warm. That's the least romantic way anyone has ever told me they love them. I'm a cattleman, not a poet, Jonah said. But I mean it exactly as much either way. That's the story tonight. A school teacher who inherited a life she never asked for and turned out to be exactly built for it. And a man who'd spent 11 years mistaking every offered hand for a trap until one woman was precise enough and patient enough to offer him something he couldn't mistake for charity, even with all his old instincts working against him. Thank you for spending this evening with us. If Jonah and Josephine found a place in your heart tonight, there's more waiting here whenever you're ready. And if there's a good offer in front of you that your pride is telling you to refuse, take a second look before you ride off. Sometimes it really is exactly what it looks like.